So without further ado, let's get started with our first talk on acceptance and commitment therapy from Shamash. So Shamash is one of the UK's leading professional mindfulness teachers. He's the international best-selling author of Mindfulness for Dummies and The Mindful Way Through Stress. He's the co-founder of the world's first Museum of Happiness in London. And more recently, Shamash has been training practitioners in acceptance and commitment therapy. His work has been featured in numerous newspapers, magazines, TV and radio shows all over the world. You can learn more at www.shamashalidina.com. So I'm just going to turn my webcam and mic off here, and we're just going to get started. So hope you guys enjoy, and good luck, Shamash. Okay.
Thank you, Niall. Thank you to Weekend University for inviting me to share about a topic I'm really passionate about. I'm really excited that this is the first time Weekend University is going online. So it's not just limited to people that can make it to London. So although we're going through this challenge, that's one benefit of that. And I can see people chatting away in the chat window. Hi, Vanessa and other new friends. Great to meet you. So yeah, if you do get distracted and end up being on social media, that's my handle on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all that, if you want to share. But maybe do that at the breaks and maybe try and focus mindfully if you can for this session. So, as Niall said, I'm a big fan of mindfulness, and I'm guessing quite a lot of you are too. And so I thought before we start talking lots and lots of theory about ACT, it'd be good to practice mindfulness, which is very much part of that model and that approach. And if you have done mindfulness, which I'm guessing, about 90% of you may have, it's good to try different approaches and different techniques. In fact, there's almost an infinite number of different ways in which you can practice mindfulness. And this is a nice one, both for yourselves and for any of you who have clients or coachees and you want to share it with others, even with children. So you can call it a grounding exercise, or I like to call it a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 approach. So let's have a go at this. Some people are saying that they can't hear the sound. So hopefully, if you can hear me speaking, can you just type in the chat window that you can hear me? Okay, sound is good. So it might be on the other end. Good. Okay, so let's start with this grounding exercise. Oh wow, the first helicopter of the day since I mentioned that. Okay, so for this mindful exercise, let's start by having our eyes open. And I invite you to notice 5 different things that you can see. So just look around in the room that you're in. I don't know if you're indoors or lucky enough to be outdoors for a bit, maybe in your garden, but just noticing 5 different things that you can see, and notice the distance between you and that object, and try and notice the specific colors. Mindfulness is about cultivating the sense of curiosity. So see if you can trigger a bit of curiosity. I can see a lamp and I can see that it's got a certain shade of gray and white that I hadn't noticed before. It's got a lot more dust than I was expecting as well. But just noticing it rather than judging it. So look around your room and choose 5 different things and notice something new about them. Okay, you may have had time for a 5 or a few, but however far you've got, now just gently allow your eyes to close and tune into the sensations in your body. Yes, there will be thoughts, there will be feelings, that all comes as well, but there's also the sensation of your body on the chair or lying down in the bed. I don't know where you are exactly. And just notice the sensations in your body. So for me, I can feel the weight of my body in the chair, my back against the back of the chair, my hands on my laps, my feet on the floor. And also scan my body for any areas of discomfort, because mindfulness makes space for all sensations, including discomfort. I can notice there's a little bit of tightness in my lower back, and I just let it be. So in that way, just noticing 4 different things you feel. And then hearing. See if you can hear 3 different things. So one of them, hopefully, is the sound of my voice. But what else can you hear in your room? Maybe it's the sound of your computer, the sound of your breath, the sounds outside. And now it gets a little bit more tricky. Noticing scent. What can you smell? You may be able to notice two distinct forms of scent, but maybe not, but just see what you notice. And notice how quickly the judgmental mind can dive in with not being able to smell or not liking a smell or not wanting to do it. That's the mind talking. And then number 1 for taste. Notice if you can feel any taste in your mouth. Maybe I can taste a little bit of my porridge still left over. You might be able to taste that, your breakfast, or maybe the minty taste of your toothbrushing. Or maybe there's no taste there at all. And then finally, centering or grounding yourself from the breath. And see if you can focus and feel a few deep breaths. And see if you can feel the fullness of each in-breath and the fullness of each out-breath. Good. So, gradually allowing your eyes to open and coming back to your surroundings, coming back to the room. And yeah, just noticing how you're feeling now, noticing what effect that had. Okay, so there's a little grounding exercise that we did. Okay, some people are sharing. Christina says feeling very grounded, and Sumra says calming. Calm and present. That's nice to hear. Thank you. And remember, and I'll emphasize this, and in fact, this is what ACT is all about. It's about making space for however we're feeling and making space for the feeling. And it's so tempting, especially in mindfulness, when they associate it with calm and peace and relaxation, as if that's the goal. And if we don't achieve that feeling, then we've done something wrong. And even in the early days, I used to teach mindfulness, and I used to be hesitant to, why not also encourage relaxation when we come to teach mindfulness? But I remember reading one study where they took 2 groups of people. One group were doing mindfulness, the other were doing relaxation. And they were clever in the way they guided both of those exercises. They didn't use the word mindfulness for the mindfulness group. They didn't use the word relaxation for the relaxation group. But they just kind of said, so for the relaxation group, it would be about letting go of your muscles and feeling heavy. For the mindfulness group, it's about being aware, being awake, noticing, becoming curious. And these groups had recurring depression, I believe. And there was no kind of positive benefit for the relaxation group, but for the mindful group, the rate of recurrence of depression reduced. So it shows you subtle difference, but actually makes a huge difference, that sense of curiosity. So this is very much an introduction to ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, or it also stands for Acceptance and Commitment Training. And I teach it more from a training perspective, actually. But most people like to refer it to Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. So I'll be sharing with you today what is ACT, how do you actually do it, and then finally how you can learn more about it. So that's what the shape of the day is for today. And so I thought about whether or not I should include this little story about myself, but I always love hearing stories from other people about how they got to doing what they're doing. So I thought I'd start with this. So I found the cutest picture I could of myself with a plant in the background. There's that one. Do I look similar? No, I look very different. So my story was actually I enjoyed science when I was a child, and I was good at it at school, and I was praised a lot for my success in academics world, but particularly in science. And so I built up my sense of self-esteem and my ego, I guess, on the fact that I was good at science and I was good at maths and I was good at school. And so I built myself up on that. And I was very much focused on just money, to be honest, unfortunately. So I remember when I was choosing what degree to go for, I just looked at, what involves science, what gives the highest salary. And chemical engineering came up. So I thought, okay, I'll do that. And I went off to a university and I studied chemical engineering. But my first shock came in my second year. So the first year of university, I found out that, it's not so easy to be top of the class when you've got people coming in from all over the world who are also just as good at you as science, or even better at you than science. So that was hard. That was a little bit of a knock to my ego, which was probably a good thing. But I thought, it doesn't matter. I'm still good and I'm going to get a good degree and I'm going to get this job in chemical engineering. I'm going to make all this money and I'm going to be happy and get married and all this stuff. So that was kind of an unconscious thinking. But when I tried it as a job in the summer in my second year, I went off to work and I found myself in the office designing an oil rig in Indonesia, sitting in an office in London. And I found it so boring. I used to go for these huge lunch breaks and you had to swipe in and out. And my lunch breaks were so long, I ended up getting a negative paycheck. And I remember, but I was still earning good money for the first few months anyway in the summer. And I remember spending that money. It was actually just on clothes, actually, in Oxford Street. I specifically remember buying the stuff, which I was really, really hoping to be able to get. And then just feeling this great emptiness and this sense of like, this is so unfulfilling. And that I've been taught this false hope or this false dream that, everything would be great and I would feel really happy earning this money. And I didn't. So I wouldn't know what to do. And I found myself on the underground in London. I saw a poster for a philosophy class, practical philosophy class. And I thought, practical philosophy, that sounds like the opposite of chemical engineering. Let me try that. And I tried it. And that was my moment of transformation and discovery of mindfulness. That was 22 years ago, where they did an exercise similar to that grounding exercise, but we also stepped back from our thoughts and emotions. And I guess I would describe it, I haven't described it like this before, but I guess that was my first kind of spiritual moment or spiritual experience, which is that sense of being the observer of my thoughts, being the observer of my emotions and not being them. And I was just talking to Niall earlier before we started this, and he had a bit of that experience when he read Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now, and that sense of we are not our thoughts. And I thought, oh my God, I'm so old when I'm taught this. I'm 20 years old. I wish I learned this when I was a kid, more like when I was this little smiley kid there. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to become a school teacher and find the one school that actually offers this, and I'm going to be a school teacher there. So that's what I did. I managed to just about finish my degree. I studied non-duality in the spiritual place as well, called another word for it's Advaita, but I became a school teacher and I taught, bit of effectively mindfulness in the morning and in the afternoon and all that stuff, and got very much interested in that. And then it wasn't called mindfulness at that time, and this story is going to get too long, so I'll speed it up a bit. But I ended up publishing this book, Mindfulness for Dummies, and becoming a full-time mindfulness teacher. And then I started thinking, okay, mindfulness is good, but maybe there's more to well-being than, and happiness is the purpose. So maybe we don't need to just use mindfulness. Let's use other approaches. So that's how I got interested in positive psychology. But positive psychology, you and me may have heard of it, but the general public don't know what we're talking about. And so I saw an advert for a fizzy drink, which was saying drink happiness. And I thought, if they're using happiness in that way, let's use happiness in a way to actually educate people in mindfulness and positive psychology. So I started the Museum of Happiness. And then when we were running the Museum of Happiness, that was great. And we still continue to run it. But the thing that people were really finding challenges about was self-compassion. They were very harsh on themselves and unkind to themselves. So a lot of our classes and courses started to lean towards self-compassion and being kind to ourselves. So we kind of started doing more of that. And I think you may have had some speakers at Weekend University on self-compassion and mindful self-compassion. And the work of Christine Neff and her colleagues focus on that quite a lot. So self and compassion was wonderful. And people found that transformative. And so did I. But I found myself I'm not sure if the right word is too self-compassionate, but it didn't have that motivation element. So I would be compassionate to myself and kind to myself and not be harsh to myself. But then there'd be no sense of clarity about what direction I want to go in or what I want to do. And so then I started getting interested in the whole world of habit formation. And again, I think you've had some great speakers on there. I think Sharu, I remember going to her talk. And that is really fascinating because that's all about habit change and how the importance of taking small steps and changing our behavior. And so I got very interested in that and writing about that and blogging and making videos about that. But again, still something felt missing. And it was only until I revisited ACT, which I'd first studied a while back when I'd first got into mindfulness, and it really moved on since then. So I studied it more again last year and started sharing more about it. I think it's such a wonderful package because first of all, it brings together behavior change, but it also brings together mindfulness and all the insights I had from mindfulness, and also talks about what is called the transcendent self. So most people, not everyone would call ACT a spiritual approach. That's kind of my opinion that I'm putting onto it. But a good proportion do, because it's got this element of the mindfulness, which is about this stepping back, being the observer self, or seeing how our consciousness is actually connected to everyone's consciousness as well. And so it's got really good, rigorous science behind it, which I'm a great fan of. But it's also got the world of mindfulness and even this touch of spirituality, which I very much value. And so I really like that package, how it brings it all together. And that's why I'm really, really passionate about it. The other beautiful thing about ACT, and so I'll start talking a bit more about ACT here, is the founder of it, the guy called Dr. Stephen Hayes. And there's loads of great things about him and his colleagues. But the thing that I really liked is that, and he shared this in a couple of lectures, and the way he's designed it, is that they're not using a kind of hierarchical approach to the organization. So normally he says that in most therapies and most approaches, if you are teaching it, there would be the person at the top who discovered it, and then he would train the lead trainers, and then those trainers would train the trainers underneath them. And you get this kind of triangle of hierarchy where you have to do a specific training developed by the original trainer, and that person would end up making a huge income from it too. But he said, no, I don't want to do this. I want to make it. I've seen the danger of doing this in the Eastern world with the gurus, and the same things happening in the Western world with psychologists and psychotherapists and scientists as well. He says, we don't want to take that approach. So what they've done in ACT is they said that there's no one standardized certified program that says that, yes, now you're an ACT trainer or you're an ACT teacher. In fact, they found through research that just reading a book on ACT, there's beneficial effects of that. You may do a very short training program, and there's been a whole bunch of randomized control trials which are based on ACT training that just lasts for as long as we are in here today, a couple of hours, and the measurable benefits of that. So he's kept it very open. Anybody could learn it in any way that they want and can start sharing it however they want to. So it brings it all together, and it's this kind of open sourced approach, which I absolutely love. So that's one of the reasons why I really like ACT. So I want to start with where a lot of books on ACT start with, which is the idea of suffering, and is it natural to suffer? So I'm just going to share with you a few facts about mental health. But before I do that, let's just consider where we are. So I'm going to read a few paragraphs from a book called A Liberated Mind by the founder of ACT. He says that there's no question that we made incredible progress over the last 50 years. That the computer in your pocket called your phone is 120 million times more powerful than the computer that was used to land Apollo 11 on the moon, which is incredible. The progress in health technology has been amazing too. So leukemia used to kill 86% of children who contracted it 50 years ago. Now it kills less than half of that. In the last 25 years, child mortality, mothers that die giving childbirth, and deaths from malaria have all declined almost 50%. So our physical health has kind of improved manyfold. And even as I speak now during this crisis we are going to have at the moment, I would say even despite that, still, generally speaking, things have developed so much, haven't they? And you may have heard about how Steven Pinker in his book talks about how violence has actually been going down for years and years and years. And so one question you could reflect on is that if you could not choose where you were born, you could only choose when you were born. For your physical well-being, the best time to be born would be now, or maybe not now because of this virus, maybe next year, but around this time would be the best time. It wouldn't matter where on the planet you are. You couldn't choose that, let's say. You could only choose the time. The best time would be now because it's the lowest levels of violence, the best level of healthcare, generally speaking, around the world, lowest levels of mortality for so many different diseases. Yet, when it comes to mental health, suffering is so much greater. And it's one of the few things that is going up. So just to share with you a few facts about that, and I'm sure some of you may be aware of this, mental illness is rapidly becoming much more of a problem, not less. In 1990, depression was the fourth leading cause of disability and disease worldwide, after respiratory infections, diarrheal illnesses, and prenatal conditions. In 2000, it was a third leading cause. By 2010, it ranked second. In 2017, the World Health Organization rated it number one. So the number one cause of disability in the world. And for stats, sorry, I only got the US stats here, but approximately 40 million Americans over age 18 have been diagnosed as having an anxiety disorder, and almost 10% of Americans report frequent mental distress. So there's a real problem here. And now some people try and argue that, it's because of people are talking more about, mental health challenges, and that's why. But it's not just diagnosis, it's even levels of suicide, isn't it? And it's for our young people too. So this is not just numbers that we're making up because people are talking about it more. This actually even results in greater levels of suicide too. So we're in a mental health crisis at the moment, and we need to address that and consider some reasons why. To quote Dr. Stephen Hayes on this, the founder of ACT, he believes it's because of us as human beings and our minds have not evolved fast enough to cope with the changes in technology. So if you consider the invention of radio and then television, and it tends to be communication, and then the internet, and then now social media, and then AI and other stuff that's coming, these things are relatively coming in very fast in our evolution. And yet our human beings haven't had enough time to evolve to be able to manage or cope with them. And it's because of the way we process language and the way language connects everything together. And I'll talk more about this as I talk through ACT. So the suffering that we're experiencing is potentially due to the modern world that we live in and the way the human mind has evolved to work. And it hasn't evolved to work properly, potentially because we've evolved for a very short time. Okay, the maximum they think it's human beings and the way our brains work is between 200,000 and 2 million years old, which is tiny compared to the hundreds of millions of years of evolution. And so it's almost like an experiment of our environment, that this human brain has evolved with this ability to process language and the levels of self-consciousness that we have. And we're yet to see, what impact that will have over the very long term. But it's certainly very much early days when it comes to the evolution of that. One of the challenges, one of the reasons perhaps that we suffer so much is because of comparison and this idea of we are not good enough. So we have very much a culture of our society of comparison and of wanting to improve things. So it's very much a problem-solving approach. And it's because it's not our fault, it's not anyone's fault, it's the way the human brain has evolved to solve problems. And that's been our strength, but it also becomes our weakness when it comes to the internal world. I'll explain why. The way our brains work and the way we process language and what ACT is based on is actually a theory of language called relational frame theory, RFT. And what they've found is they think is the difference between the human brain and other animal brains is our ability to make connections between different things. So, I may see an object and I'd say, okay, that's an apple. Or I teach a young child that that's an apple. And then they can make that connection between the sound apple and the actual object, the apple, and the fact that it's a food. And we can make these kind of bi-directional connections or tri-directional connections between them all. And I don't have time to go into all the details, and I haven't even gone into it all myself. But basically, we can actually make relationships both ways between things. And so one way in which we suffer would be, for example, let's say you're with your partner and you're watching the sunset and you end up breaking up with each other. Now, that was something that happened at a moment in the past, but you come to another day and you're looking at the sunset and it's just a beautiful sunset and you're in the moment, but there's a connection between you seeing that sunset and that past memory of having had a breakup. And so you could be in the moment, which is the most beautiful moment, and yet the human brain can create suffering in that moment because of that memory and the loss that was associated with it. Whereas most likely for an animal or something like that, that connection wouldn't be taking place because of the language and the way they process language is different. They don't have that access that we have. Anyway, so this idea of not being good enough, this quick fix culture may be part of our problem too. So, we know that some societies more than others, but taking medication is one thing. You have a headache, it's seen as a problem, and so we try and fix that problem straight away. And so we're marketed a drug like a headache pill, which is fine, but it's one thing that we do. That sense of feeling alone, that sense of being lonely, we have this incredible computer in our pocket so that within seconds, you'd see that phone would come out and that would trigger us using social media. And this is a whole talk in itself, but all the social media companies are using the best psychology and neuroscience they know to try and make their apps as addictive as possible and to reduce that loneliness or to use the feeling as a trigger for you to actually use that app, because if they get paid through advertising through you using it more. You have a sense of boredom or curious about something, rather than thinking it through or reflecting, immediately you'd go to Google. And then taking things more to the extreme, not even having the thought, my body is not good enough, and then considering plastic surgery. You don't see many dogs or cats or monkeys thinking, you know what, I really don't like my nose, I need to get some plastic surgery. But it's something that human beings do. So we use this same approach, first of all, in the outside world, but then we also use it for our inner world. So, for example, we have negative thoughts, and we think, okay, I want to get rid of negative thoughts. What do I need to do? And the logical thing seems to be to think positively. And I was just looking at some research this morning that found that actually positive thinking makes things worse for you most when you need it. And why is that? This relates to this theory of language that ACT is based on. If you think, I'm not good enough, let's say that's your negative thought and you want to get rid of it. So you have this idea, which seems logical. Let me say to myself, I am good enough, I am good enough, I am good enough. Now, if someone's going around saying I'm good enough all the time, they're doing it because they're trying to get rid of a thought associated with it or opposite to it, which is not good enough. So even opposites are connected. There's a relationship between the two. So they find that when you really need it, positive thinking doesn't work because of the positive thought is being used to counteract the negative one. And so it reminds you of that negative thought in the first place. And the same goes, and I will talk more about this for feelings as well. So these things that we think which work well for the outside world, like, I've got a bottle of water here and I want to get rid of that bottle of water, I can just throw it over there and the bottle would go over there. But unfortunately, the way our minds work, the way cognitions work, the more we try to push things away, the more energy we have to try and get rid of them, the more they come back. It's almost like a rubber band. Someone says the need to explore the negative is more. Yeah, perhaps. Yes, exactly. So one way to teach about this idea of suffering and how our thoughts create suffering is an old story which some of you may have heard of. It's an old spiritual story, I think might be from Buddhism. It's the story of the two arrows. And the story goes, this is back before people got shot by bullets rather than arrows. So back in the day, imagine you're walking along in the forest and you're just getting on with your thing, and you get hit by an arrow. Someone fires an arrow and it hits you in your arm. And so the first arrow is the arm that creates the pain of that sensation. So you're like, my arm really hurts. That's really, really painful. I can feel the sensation of the arrow in my arm. That's the first arrow, the physical sensation of the pain, the actual pain itself in that moment. But then there's the second arrow, which is the arrow of like, oh my God, what's going to happen to me? Who hit me with this arrow? I wonder if that person with the arrow had the virus. What's going to happen to, oh my God, my arm might have to be amputated. Oh, if I can't do that, how am I going to pay my mortgage? And then I'm going to have to lose my house. And then, will I be able to get another house with this government? And then your thoughts just go on and on and on. You perseverate, you kind of ruminate about the worst thing that can happen. And so I think it was the Buddha who said, yes, you get shot by the first arrow, but be warned of the second arrow. The first arrow we cannot get away with, and he would classify that as pain. And then the second arrow is more optional, and that's the suffering. And that's everything that we put onto that initial experience. So this is a nice equation that I like to refer to, which is pain times the resistance is the suffering. So that pain could be the physical pain of the arrow, but that arrow could also represent a difficult feeling sad, feeling upset, feeling angry, feeling frustrated. It could be a sensation of pain, like a stomachache or a headache. It could be a thought that pops into your head. I'm not good enough, or I can't do this, or why does this always happen to me? So that's the initial experience. And then the resistance is everything that you do to try and stop that happening, which is quite natural. So please, I want to keep emphasizing, this is not about trying to blame yourself. This is about us trying to explore and understand how the human brain works and why do human beings, millions and millions and millions of them, suffer so much. And this could be part of the reason. And we're arguing that this is part of the reason. It's the resistance to it. And that resistance in research is called experiential avoidance. So as some of you may know, us human beings have a negativity bias, and a good way to, just like other mammals, and just a good way to see it is, I just noticed it with pigeons actually. So, if there's a pigeon or any bird around and you stamp your foot nearby, the pigeon would fly away. Or if you even just move suddenly, the pigeon would kind of jerk away, right? Why does it do that? Because 99.9% of the time, you're not going to hurt the pigeon and the pigeon doesn't get hurt. And it's because of evolution, because of that 0.01% of the time, when you do stamp your foot or some other animal gets close, the pigeon would get eaten. So it's an approach which is essentially better safe than sorry. It's better for that pigeon to keep moving away, running away, and allowing its fear system to get triggered because of that 0.1% chance that it would get injured or get hurt. And us human beings have that too. So some small thing happens, but it's quite easy for us to go to the worst case scenario from a evolutionary perspective, because of that becomes the part of the group of human beings that survive, the ones that think more negatively and think that have a negativity bias. And remember, I saw this quote the other day, and remember, negative thinking is not a bad thing. For example, if you have a pilot of a plane, do you want them to be very, very positive when, one of their engines isn't really working too well, or if the wing isn't looking very great, or they've had a few drinks, they're like, no, we'll be fine, I'm sure. We've got another engine as a backup. What's the worst that can happen? No, you want them to be having this negativity bias so that they make sure that the plane is working properly. And if there's any chance that something could go wrong, they think, okay, let's be better safe than sorry, rather than just take a chance. So remember not to see negative thinking as bad and positive thinking as good as well. So with our brand new, relatively speaking, from an evolutionary perspective, supercharged human minds that's solving things day and night, this negativity bias, it kind of gets supercharged in from a negative perspective. Like I mentioned with the arrow, like we get hit by an arrow and we think about how it's, how we're going to end up being homeless or something. Whereas if an animal was hurt by an arrow, you can imagine that essentially the animal would be focusing on that actual first arrow, that sensation of pain. There wouldn't be so much of the resistance and the experiential avoidance internally that we do. So perhaps what we're arguing is that perhaps this is the trap. Maybe this is what ACT has discovered, and a lot of ancient cultures too, that avoidance is part of the problem, experiential avoidance. Certainly in the studies, hundreds and hundreds of studies that they found suggested the more we practice experiential avoidance, avoiding difficult thoughts, avoiding difficult emotions and difficult sensations, that can be directly associated with struggle, mental health challenges, and even our success as human beings. So what we're saying is, and one of the most popular books on ACT in the world is called The Happiness Trap. And I've got a copy here by Russ Harris, The Happiness Trap. And this is the text version, but there's also a kind of a comic strip version, and really, really good book. And it's written by Russ Harris, as I said. And he argues that actually in our modern cultures, we think that we should be happy all the time. And this shoulding of ourselves to be happy is actually a cause of a lot of suffering. I also heard him talking on a podcast where he said, actually, our definition of happiness has changed. So in the last 100 years or less, we've defined happiness as feeling good. But before then, for thousands of years, happiness was about doing good. It was about our values. It's about what we stood for. It was about actions. It wasn't about feelings. But it's only more recently that happiness is associated with actually a feeling good. So what we're saying in an ACT approach is actually what's wrong, first of all, with being happy for no reason, but also what's wrong with being sad for no reason too. So what I'm going to do now is show you a video made by Russ Harris on the Happiness Trap. And I want you to kind of just listen and watch it and just reflect. Before you judge it, just be completely open and if you're watching it with all your ideas, like this is what happiness is and this is what happiness isn't, then you're not going to really learn anything new. And same for me too. So see if you can set aside all your judgments and just be fully present in this video. And I'll be interested to see what you share. So here we go. It's called The 3 Happiness Myths.
Popular ideas about happiness will make you miserable if you actually hold on to them too tightly, believe them too much, or let them dictate how you live your life. And there are three big happiness myths in particular that create this happiness trap. The first is the idea that happiness is the natural state for human beings. If you give human beings food, water, shelter, and loving relationships, they're just going to naturally be happy. You've probably heard this myth in many forms. The reality is that the normal state for a human being is an ever-changing flow of emotions. Emotions are like the weather, continually changing. You wouldn't say the natural state for the weather is a warm spring, sunny afternoon. It's natural in winter that it's going to be colder. In summer, it's going to be hotter. And so it is with our emotions. You expect to feel anxious in challenging situations with an uncertain outcome. You expect to feel fear when there's danger or threat present. Now, the second big happiness myth links to the first one, the idea that happiness means feeling good. If you look at most dictionary definitions of happiness, it's described as a state of pleasure or a state of contentment. Well, if this is your notion of happiness, then there's no such thing as lasting happiness. Because how long does a good feeling last? Think of the happiest day of your life. How long did a state of pleasure or contentment last before there was some frustration, disappointment, anxiety, irritation? If I were to define the word happiness, I would describe it as living a rich, full, and meaningful life in which we feel the full range of human emotions. The things that make life rich, full, and meaningful don't just give us pleasant feelings. Like, think about building loving relationships. Think about people that you love and care about and you spend a long time with. Do you have a relationship like that in your life that only gives rise to pleasant feelings? When relationships are going well, There's often wonderful feelings of love and joy, but all relationships come with tension and conflict and difficulty. If you're a parent, if you have children, then you know that having kids brings a huge amount of meaning and purpose and fulfillment into your life. But what other feelings does it give you? Now, when I ask this question to audiences at my public workshop, there's a big laugh, and then parents start calling out anxiety, guilt, frustration, anger, rage. You know, it's like amazing how these people that we love so much can arouse such strong, painful emotions in us. So this holds true for really any meaningful life project, from building a career, from looking after your body, from building a family. The things that make life rich, full, and meaningful give you plenty of painful emotions, as well as some very pleasant ones. And the third big myth that feeds into the other two is the idea if you're not happy, you're defective. More and more, human nature is being pathologized as signs there's something wrong with you and you need some medication to fix it. The reality is that if you're not happy, you're normal. Life is difficult. You know, I ask my public workshops, is there anybody here who thinks life is too easy, that needs some more difficulty in their life? Anybody in this room that needs some more pain and suffering? You know, life is hard and challenging. Not always, but a lot of the time it is.
Okay, I think most of you could hear it, but there were maybe one or two people or a few more that couldn't hear it. It's also on YouTube, so if you type the happiness trap, you'll be able to watch it later if you weren't able to catch it. But essentially, it's saying, is happiness feeling good? Maybe it's not feeling good. Maybe it's about fulfillment. Maybe it's about living a purposeful life. So what does ACT stand for? ACT stands for Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, or Acceptance or Commitment Training. Okay, and it's pronounced ACT, not ACT. And the reason is because ACT sounds very similar then to ECT, which is electroconvulsive therapy, and you don't want to go down that line. So I call it ACT, and it's nice. ACT is a lovely acronym too, because it's got an action element behind it. So as Russ Harris said in his video, rather than focusing on happiness as a feeling good, what about if we approach it in a different way? What about if we approach it defining it as a rich, full, and meaningful life? And so we're not focusing on trying to feel like this or feel like that, but we focus more on our actions and we create a fulfilling life. And if it sometimes may feel good, it sometimes may not feel good. And he gave a great example of relationships or bringing up kids, things like that. Yeah. It's a wonderful experience, relationships, but we can't say it always makes us feel good. There'll be times when it makes us feel good, and there'll be times where you have some arguments and disagreements and frustrations, and especially with children, you know, they get up to all sorts of stuff which you may not be happy about and not feel good about at the time. But it is a meaningful experience for most people. It's fulfilling. It's difficult, but it is fulfilling. So this ACT approach is focusing on actually cultivating one essential skill. And that skill is called psychological flexibility. Now, the amount of research on this is incredible, and I'm always surprised that it took me so long to discover it and how very few others know about it. And so I'm going to read another paragraph. So although it's called psychological flexibility, this psychological flexibility is made up of 6 different elements. And so ACT focuses on these 6 skills, which together can be measured as your psychological flexibility. But just to give you a sense of the power of this, over the last 35 years, the ACT community has studied a small set of skills that say more about how human lives will unfold than any other single set of mental and behavioral processes previously known to science. This is not an exaggeration. In over 1,000 studies, we've found that these skills help determine why some people thrive after life challenges and some don't. why some people experience many positive emotions like joy, gratitude, compassion, curiosity, and others, very few. They predict who is going to develop a mental health problem, such as anxiety, depression, trauma, or substance abuse, and how severe or long-lasting the problem will be. These skills predict who will be effective at work, who will have healthy relationships, who will succeed in dieting and exercise, who will rise to the challenges of physical disease, how people will do in athletic competition, and how they will perform in many other areas of human endeavor. So this is why it's not just called acceptance and commitment therapy. It is a trans-diagnostic approach. That's how they describe it. So it's not something that's designed as a certain program for a certain challenge. It's looking at the human brain as a whole, the human mind. It's looking at humans as a whole. And they've looked at what is it that's essentially causing suffering? What is it that creates human flourishing? And amazingly, they've come up with these 6 core skills, which if we develop, helps us to create psychological flexibility. And then that psychological flexibility has an impact on so many different things. So as I said, the aim is to cultivate a meaningful life, a fulfilling life, a rich life, and psychological flexibility is the approach for that. So what, people say, oh, my life is meaningful or my life's not meaningful. I always struggle to understand what it is, but in Acts, they're very clear about it. They say a meaningful life, a fulfilling life is about a life which is aligned with values, but it's a life that's in line with your values. So it never imposes what your values are. It's quite clear about what values mean. It's not a goal. So it's not a place you get to. So a metaphor that's often used is like a compass. Like if you've got a compass and the compass is pointing direction west and you move in a westerly direction, you never get to west. You're always traveling in that direction. It gives you a direction to go in, and then you may go to different points along that route. In the same way, values are like your compass. They give you a sense of direction. And so it's up to each of us to start reflecting what our values are, what is most meaningful for us, what do we want our life to stand for. It's about what kind of person we want to be and what kind of things that we want to do with our lives. And the tricky thing with values is that we start to take values from what we want other people to think about us, but don't think about that. So imagine you're almost like on a deserted island. Nobody's going to be watching what you're doing. How would you spend your time? What would you find most fulfilling? How would you want to be, even if nobody was looking? And that can start giving you a bit of a clue. I'll talk probably more about values towards the end of this talk, but just in case I don't get to it, people kind of get a bit too caught up about, okay, is my value this or that? Should I have 3 values, 5 values, 1 value? But it's more about being experimental with it. So, you could just pick a value. Like, I'm guessing a lot of values here are about learning and about teaching and about curiosity. A lot of you probably have those values. So you can engage with that value in the actions that you do. And you're doing that today with this talk, attending Weekend University, but you can do it with other things, or when you're in your relationships. Rather, if you're struggling with it, maybe think of it as more like a learning process or a place where you can be curious and grow. And so now you're starting to use that value, which is in your heart, which is core to who you are, and you're living that value in everything you do. So then your actions become more fulfilling. But you can be playful with it. You can test a value out for a week, and then next week your value can be playfulness, and the next week the value can be being kind. You can experiment. You don't need to fix yourself to thinking, okay, these are my values, and I must keep thinking about what my values are. You can just try them out. So in terms of, if you want to be a bit more formal in your definition, psychological flexibility is the skill of being able to be present. So that's the mindful bit. But actually, there's 4 elements to mindfulness. That's the other beauty about this model. It's actually broken down the 4 elements of what makes mindfulness mindfulness. And I love it for that reason. It's about the skill of being present or flexibly present and taking action on living the kind of life you wish to live. So you're living a life. So let's say if your value is learning, okay? So you're able to be present and you take action in your life to learn and grow and be curious, which is the kind of person you want to be, perhaps. And the other element of ACT is the acceptance bit, skillfully accepting your tricky thoughts, your difficult emotions and sensations. So let's say, for example, you're a lecturer and Niall says, you know what, we would love to have a lecture with you next week. We want you to give you a talk at Weekend University. And you love that because of your topic is, whatever it is, the psychology of the brain or something. And that's your speciality. So you want to give a talk on that. But when you get invited to do it, you start feeling anxious because you care about it. You start having difficult thoughts like, what if I'm not good enough? Or what if people laugh at me? You start having tricky emotions like, oh no, I'm feeling nervous or anxious. Other sensations come up. What ACT is saying is that, yes, these feelings, thoughts do come up, and we're going to give you the range of different mindful skills to make space for them and allow them to be there and to take them with you, to carry them with you. So you never get rid of them, as a sense. And the goal is not to get rid of them. The goal is a fulfilling life, a meaningful life. And a meaningful life for you, for example, is to learn and to teach. And so you go ahead and do that, and you take the tricky thoughts with you. It's not about getting rid of them. And I explained earlier why it's not about getting rid of them, because remember, if you have a negative thought and you start fighting it and pushing it, if you have a difficult emotion and you start to experientially avoid it, it strengthens. So it's about carrying them and taking them with you and moving towards a fulfilling life. So one of the most popular metaphors used in ACT, and ACT uses loads and loads of metaphors because if they feel from a language perspective, and through their research, they find metaphors, analogies, stories work really well for people because it helps them to picture what's going on, and they can apply that metaphor in themselves for their own therapeutic benefit. So I'm going to show you another video now. It's going to be a 5-minute one. This is also on YouTube. So if for whatever reason it's not coming up on your computer, you can just type, ACT passengers in the bus video and it will come up for you. And I want you to think about which passengers do you have on your bus? So think about this. And if you could have some paper and pen, I'm guessing most of you have something like that nearby, or on your phone if you want, but probably better on paper and pen. What passengers do you have on your bus? What do they tell you to do? And then afterwards, we'll also consider what would your life look like if you took your passengers with you and followed towards your values, followed your heart instead of trying to make them shut up. So I'm going to play this video now. As I say, it's also on YouTube. So any problems, you can watch it there too. Passengers on the bus video. It's just under 5 minutes.
I'm Tom. This is the story of my bus of life. On the journey, I pick up lots of passengers, memories, thoughts, emotions, some pleasant, some not so pleasant. Sometimes handling them can be tricky.
I knew you'd come this way again. Same old, same old.
You're pathetic.
What a grumpy lot. Don't worry, driver, I can sort them out.
Don't even think about going down there.
That way will never work out.
Where's that bus going? It looks exciting.
What do you think you're doing? You think you have what it takes? You'll just fail like last time. Dream on.
What's the point? It's too much work. Why take the risk?
Haha, it's not like it's your choice. This is my bus.
Okay, I'll turn around. Just be quiet.
Listen, let's make a secret deal. You keep doing what you're doing and I'll keep the passengers quiet for you.
Okay then, back to the same old road. Just so you know, I'm not happy about this. I like driving buses, but what I'd really love to do is be a race driver.
Loser, what do you think you're doing?
Better stick to what you know, or the deal is off.
Race driver? You're a loser. Stick to driving buses.
Right, that's it. This is my bus. Get off.
Yeah, fight me. Let's see where that gets you. You pathetic excuse for a driver.
Your bus ain't going anywhere now. I don't know why you bother driving.
Hey, what's going on in that bus? Things seem to be happening differently.
You're not allowed to go that way. We've got rules.
Thanks for the feedback, guys, but this is my bus.
Maybe I don't need to get rid of this bunch. They could just come with me for the ride.
Whatever, you're still a loser.
I don't know about this.
No, what about the deal?
Racetrack, that's where I want to go.
See, we told you. What were you thinking?
You could never be a racing driver. Just play it safe.
Hang on tight, guys. Here we go.
Okay, I'm back. So hopefully you managed to watch that, and I hope you hopefully enjoyed it. I saw a couple of people saying that's a great video to show to clients, to see thoughts as thoughts and not true, or allow the negative thoughts to control our behavior. You've reminded me, saying it's not true, that you've reminded me of another kind of key element of ACT, which is about truth, actually. So in ACT, it's not so much about whether a thought is true or not. Like, from a CBT perspective, let's say if you have a negative thought, like, I'm not a good lecturer, let's say. Now, if that thought may be true or may not be true, right? But the question is not so much whether it's true or not. In ACT is it helpful to have that thought considering where you want to go? So let's take the example of this guy. He wants to be a race driver. Now, if he keeps having the thought, I'm not a good race driver, I'm not a good race driver, it may be true he's not a good race driver because he hasn't practiced being a race driver. But is it helpful for him to keep thinking, I'm not a good race driver? No, it's not helpful. So truth is not like a capital T truth. Is there an absolute truth or not? It's more about being clear about what your values are. And for him, it's about maybe, being a race driver would not be so much a value. It's more like a goal. A value would be more like, continuously improving my skills, and driving could be one of those skills. So if that's his value, he would take action towards, challenging himself to do that. And the thoughts like, I'm not a good race driver can come or not come. It doesn't matter so much. So what we're going to do is a little bit of a 1-minute journaling. I've discovered this technique of timing oneself while doing a bit of journaling for very short periods of time. And I found it really powerful. So I'm going to invite you to do that. So look at these questions, like, which passengers do you have on your bus? What did they tell you to do? And what would your life look like if you took your passengers with you and followed your heart, followed your values, followed doing what you find fulfilling, instead of trying to make the passengers shut up? Okay. So that's going to be your challenge for this journaling. I'm going to give you 60 seconds. And now the thing about this journaling is you don't think, what shall I write now? Maybe you just have to keep writing. So you take your pen touches the paper, you start writing, and you just keep writing whatever comes to your head for the answer to these questions. If nothing comes up, then you just keep writing. I don't know, nothing's coming up for me now. I'm not too sure. Maybe one of my passengers is sadness. And then you just kind of keep going and going and going. And then we'll see how we go. So your 60 seconds starts now. Okay. So now I'm going to time you for another 30 seconds. So if you just finish that sentence that you're writing, and for 30 seconds, I'm going to go back and read what you wrote and underline any key points or key insights there. So 30 seconds starts now. Go back and underline or star any key insights, key observations. Okay, and I'm going to start talking again, but if you want to carry on for a little bit more, you can. I'm just going to read some of the things that some people have had time to share for you. So, feelings like anger, grief, and resentment, be afraid or might get hurt, or some pain, difficult, uncomfortable, but might get easier with time. Someone else says fear, playing it safe, success isn't for me. So these are the kind of thoughts that kind of pop up. What we're saying with this ACT approach is you take them along with you. So we're not going to even give them the energy of trying to counter them in the sense of working out what the positive equivalent would be, or even using mindfulness in a clever way to try and get rid of them. What we're learning to see them is that they are our passengers. They don't have as much control as we give to them. Another interesting difference, like ACT is kind of seen like a CBT approach now, but the more traditional old CBT would be about challenging thoughts, wouldn't it? So you'd have a thought, perhaps like, I'm not good enough, and you'd look for evidence that actually, no, I am good enough because if I've done this and I've done that. And so you kind of look for evidence for it and you counter it. And what the ACT community have found is that element of CBT isn't so much the effective one. And in fact, it's more of the behavioral change approaches, which is what ACT talks about, is the one that really tends to make more of a difference. So yeah, I hope you found that helpful and interesting. I really think that's a wonderful metaphor for ACT, and it kind of brings them all together. It's about seeing the thoughts as just thoughts, bringing them along with you, being clear what your values are, having the values, almost imagine them at the front of your bus, and then driving in the direction of what you find kind of fulfilling and meaningful. As Helen says, yes, how much power do we give to our passengers is a good one. And somebody else has asked, is this on YouTube? Yes, it's got a lot of views as well. So Passengers on the Bus video, you just type that in on YouTube, you'll find it. Just use the word ACT, otherwise you might get some other bus videos. Great, glad you liked it. So let's talk a little bit more about, actually, I've been talking very generally about this ACT model, but let's talk a little bit more about how you can understand it more and maybe even share it with others. So ACT has got one thing, which is about one thing. Hopefully you remember that. It's about psychological flexibility. So you can see it as just one thing, or you can just think of it as cultivating a meaningful life. So as simple as that. It's about cultivating meaning, purpose, fulfillment. But if you want to break it down a little bit more, you can think of it as 3 elements. It's about being present, staying open, and taking meaningful action. So it's about learning to be flexibly present. So being in the here and now. Remember, rather than avoiding the difficult thoughts, emotions, sensations, noticing them, being curious about them. But it's also about a sense of stepping back. So not being caught up by them. And that's a skill in itself. So noticing them for what they are. It's also about being open. So this is one of the mindfulness skills. This is the other mindful skill, which is the acceptant element. And I'll talk more about that in a sec. But it's about making space, making room for these difficulties, making space for, you can see this diagram of the brain I've created. They've got all the different emotions there. So we make space for all of them. And then finally, the third one is about taking action. So this is part of why I love this approach. It's not just about being mindful and that's the end of it, but it's that actually, what am I going to do? How can I take action? But be careful with this action element. It's not about being overwhelmed by goal setting, and have I got there? And that's going to make me happy. Because as I shared in my personal story at the beginning, I had this idea like get a job or get money or get married or this or that, and then the happiness will come. What we're saying is that the joy is in the journey rather than the destination. So how do you get the joy in the journey? Through being clear about what your values are. And if you're clear about your values, you can live with them. So Ruth is asking, you said there were 6 elements, but there's only 3 here. Yes, so there's 6 elements, and I'm going to show the 6 in detail next. But if you want to make it a bit simpler, you can just remember these 3. Be present, stay open, and take action, or take meaningful action. Okay. Now let's break it up a little bit more into the core 6 elements. So we're going to go into a bit more detail now. So this is the first time I've shared this model. So quite often ACT has this model, and they call this, in a cute kind of way, the hexaflex, because that shape is a hexagon, and it's about psychological flexibility. But I've spent ages trying to work out, there's got to be an acronym to make it easier to remember the whole ACT model. And finally, I worked it out with action. So I'm excited to be sharing it with you guys today for the very first time. And A stands for acceptance. So I'm going to go through all of these 6 now. And as I explain them in more detail, it will make more sense to you. Now, remember, I said that ACT is a trans-diagnostic model. So this approach works for all diagnoses from, the most severe of depression and anxiety and all that, all the way to Olympic gold-winning medal people have managed to win the Olympics through using these flexibility skills. And I think it's being used by sports teams and things like that. And the businesses are using it. And I don't know if I have time to explain at the end, so I'll just pop it in now, in that the United Nations and the World Health Organizations have been funding a research which was published in the Lancet for use with refugee camps. And they've found positive results, being the ACT model being used in refugee camps, and they're going to repeat that experiment again. And if it agrees, then they're going to start rolling it around the world. Someone said, is it okay to share it on social media with crediting me? Yeah, absolutely fine. So ACT. So A stands for acceptance. Now, the root meaning of the word acceptance is about receiving a gift. And that's why I chose this hands, that sense of receiving a gift. Now, this is one of the most important of all of them, isn't it? It's called ACT, acceptance and commitment. So the acceptance bit is really important to understand, and it's really hard to understand what we mean by acceptance. We don't mean by acceptance. This is one of the biggest misunderstandings about acceptance. Acceptance does not mean tolerance. So if you feel a difficult emotion, we're not saying tolerate it, because tolerate is that sense of gritting your teeth while you're feeling it. What we're saying is open up to it. A great little story to explain acceptance. Imagine it's pouring outside with rain, and you need to get from here to the train station. Now, there's one attitude you can take, which is like, oh no, it's raining, I'm getting wet. And you're going to scrunch yourself up, and you go there and you get into the station, and there's definitely not a sense of acceptance there. What we're saying there with acceptance is that you may not like it. So it's pouring down with rain, you need to get to the station, and you're like, you know what? I don't like the rain, just like I don't like anxiety or I don't like sadness. But I have to accept it. It's already there. The rain is there, and I do need to get to the station. So I'm not going to create that extra suffering of resistance. So you walk purposefully from here to the train station. Yes, you do get wet. You accept that you get wet. And who knows, as you start to make space to accept getting soaked and getting wet in the rain as you go to that train station, maybe there's something you like about it. Maybe you actually enjoy some of the coolness of it. So that's the spirit of acceptance. It takes a while for us to understand what it means fully, but it's about letting go of the resistance and being with things as they are, because they're already here. Okay, something's going wrong in your life and it's already happening right now. Then the only alternative is to accept it in that space. So that's the first of the first 4 mindfulness skills. The other lucky thing about this model is the first 4 is the mindful skills. So the first is acceptance. Second one, and the opposite of psychological flexibility is psychological rigidity. And so the opposite of acceptance is experiential avoidance. And if you want to research the science behind it, if you type it in Google Scholar, experiential avoidance, you'll get all these papers about that. Second one is cognitive diffusion, he's called it. So fusion, think about fusion. When 2 things are stuck together, they're fused. So the opposite of it is cognitive fusion, when you're stuck to your thoughts. And cognitive diffusion is seeing the thought for what it is. Thoughts in act are sounds and pictures that are in your head. That's all they are. And we give meaning to them and get overwhelmed or not overwhelmed by that thought. If I say you're a flying pink elephant, if you just have that thought, it's not going to have any kind of negative impact on you because you don't believe it at all. It's like, yeah, whatever. Okay. But if I said you're an idiot or something and you believe that thought to be true, then it may create a reaction or a problem. Or if I say that you can't do this or you can't do that, if you believe these sounds and believe them to be, put a meaning onto them and then believe them to be true, that's when the problem comes. So ACT is not done like general research. They've done a lot of basic research. As I said, it's not just clinical research. They've done kind of lab research. And so they've found a whole bunch of techniques, and you can keep being creative in the techniques. It's diffusion with DEFUSION. Yeah, just like it's spelled there, it's spelled correctly there. It's a made up new word. So it's the opposite of being fused, being diffused. So it's, and then I'll share with you 1 or 2 of them. They're quite funny. They're quite playful. So it's a mindful exercise, which doesn't involve any of the traditional mindfulness meditations or anything like that. They're almost like playful games that you can use to start detaching the meaning from the sound or the picture in your head. So they're really good, and they're quite unique, which you don't find in other mindful programs so much. Third one is my favorite. I used to think of ACT as more like just a pure science model. Then I started seeing it as like a behavior change and mindfulness model. But now I see it more like a spiritual model almost, with a whole bunch of science behind it. Okay, and even Stephen Hayes calls the T in ACT the transcendent self. So it's about perspective taking. So it's about having a more flexible idea of your sense of self. So we all create a sense of self. And I was talking to Niall about this earlier. He had a great speaker, Dr. Bruce Hood, and he gave a talk called The Self-Illusion, which is quite a challenging talk because of some scientists believe that the self is created in our brains, that sense of self. And that self is almost an illusion. It's an illusion that we create. And it happens when we're like age 1.5 or 2, once we start getting this sense of self-awareness. And it's effectively like our ego. And it's a story of who we are. And so if you have the word I am followed by any other word after that, like I am good, or I am kind, or I am not good enough, or whatever that sentence ends up being, it's just a story that's coming up in your head. And you're believing that story to be true. The lecturer was called Bruce Hood. Bruce Hood. So you're creating that story in our head. Now, if that story is okay, we need to have a sense of self to be able to operate in the world. Otherwise, I would be merged with this computer and microphone and there'd be no conversation happening here. So we do need to have a sense of self. But the more flexible we can be in our sense of self, the more helpful it is. This whole model is about psychological flexibility, right? So, for example, and this is an interesting one, if I have the idea, I am a kind person, okay, I am a kind person. I go around with that story in my head, and someone says to me, oh, you did that. That was unkind. Or can you do me this favor? Can you do me this favor? Can you help me here? Can you help me there? If you have to keep proving to yourself you're a kind person, then that rigid idea would have to control all your actions. And sometimes you may not have time to help everyone in the world. Or sometimes someone will accuse you of being an unkind person or unhelpful, and you could get annoyed or angry, or it could create this conflict which doesn't need to be there. What we're saying with ACT is that let's be a lot more flexible about our sense of self. And the transcendent self element is that, like, can we become an observer of our experience? Can we see things from different perspectives? So you can call it transcendent self. You can call this observer self. You can call it perspective taking, flexible perspective taking. There's different ways of seeing it. If I have time, I'll share the story of how this links to the founder's experience. I stands for in the moment. And I think you'll know a lot about that when it comes to mindfulness, being in the here and now. But just to add a few extra things from an ACT perspective, it's about flexible present awareness. So it's not just about being in the here and now. It's about learning to be sometimes focused attention, sometimes an open, spacious awareness, and sometimes being able to move it from one thing to another. So not just about being in the here and now in a non-judgmental way and all that kind of stuff, but having this ability to flex our attention and move it around. That's the key skill in that mindful element. So these first four are mindful skills. And then for the values, I've used the image of a heart and a door to the heart. And I think that's quite nice, because of what we're saying is that these values are yours and yours alone. You get to choose what your values are. You get to choose what you want your life to be about. And then you get to practice that moment to moment. So this is not something, ACT is not like you're going to have to spend years doing ACT or months or even days doing it. You can practice it right now, today. You can start reflecting, what are my values? How can I apply my values right now? It's a moment by moment thing. So it's not like I will practice my values in 3 years' time, I will achieve this and achieve that. That may happen too, but it's a moment to moment thing. It's a values-based living is what it's about, rather than goal-orientated living. Having said that, the last prong of this hexaflex model is navigating with meaningful action. So these two are very much linked together, the values and your action. And he often calls them habits too. So you've been fortunate enough to hear some talks perhaps in the past about the importance of habits. And what we're saying here is that habits have a big influence on our lives, and we can't suddenly change all of our actions. I would argue that it's a difficult or challenging thing for us to do. But as we start to become clear about values, the good thing about the values is the values give us motivation. So we need this motivation because acceptance is hard. Doing things that make you feel anxious or feel sad or feel loneliness and all this other stuff is difficult. What would give you the motivation to make the space to do that is if you're doing something that's meaningful and taking action that's meaningful, because it feels fulfilling. Right? For me, I love this topic. I love learning and I love teaching. And so I've been given this opportunity today to share this with you. And there's some challenge there and there is some anxiety there, but I love it as well. So with that feeling of anxiety also comes that sense of fulfillment as well. You know, I'm doing something that I really care about, really believe in, and it's hard and I love it. So it's not so much about just feeling good, but it's about doing something that's fulfilling and meaningful. Okay, so that's the ACT model. Hopefully that's starting to make some sense. If this is the first time you're hearing it, it's a lot of information in a short period of time. Can I talk more about cognitive diffusion? Ask Ruth. I will. I think I'll have some exercises in that if we get to it. So I've mentioned already, sorry, there's a mistake here, 1,000 studies. There's been also a whole bunch of very high quality research in 150 randomized controlled trials. So that's a lot. And the great thing that Dr. Stephen Hayes did is he did 2 randomized controlled trials at the beginning. He found it worked, but then he didn't create a 6-week course or an 8-week course or a 4-week course. He wanted to work out what were the underlying processes that operate. And so they did that. Then they said he wanted to know why it worked. Why is it working? And so then he did this work, and he feels that he'll be most well known probably for his work on relational frame theory, which I mentioned. It's quite complicated and tricky to understand, but it's an underlying theory. It's a bit like, ACT is learning how to drive the car, but a relational frame theory is like looking at the engine and how all the different bits of the engine work. You don't really need to understand that all in detail to be able to drive the car, but if you've got the time and the ability, then you can do that. Okay, so I've already mentioned quite a bit about the science element, but I feel it's a very, very strong element of it. Just to touch a little bit more on the benefits of it, I said it's transdiagnostic, and it's not just a therapeutic model. So it can be used at different levels too. It could be used all the way from the whole of society to whole countries to communities. And he's doing a lot of work at the moment with community level development and group development. And he's linked up with an author of a book called Pro-Social. I'll type it here. It's by Atkins and Hayes. And so they're working on how you can actually apply this to groups and communities. But they've specifically found it works with stress, anxiety, social anxiety, depression, OCD, psychosis, chronic pain, abuse, diabetes, sports, business, and more. And in the business world, it's called acceptance and commitment training. And the other beauty of it, he's very happy, and the ACT community is very happy for you to pull bits and pieces of this and make it your own. So the other thing they encourage in ACT is not like you have to just do these 6 elements of ACT. You can, if you're passionate about narrative therapy and you want to put some of this in, then you can. If you're passionate about 8-week mindfulness courses, but you want to put a little bit of values-based work in it, you can just pull that element of it and put it in. So have a little think after this talk. Yeah, as Nakisa says, it's a flexible model. Yeah, luckily they're practicing what they're preaching, and they're allowing you to be flexible in the way you use the model to, and rename it however you wish to. So there's a huge flexibility in the approach too. So I've noticed that some people, sometimes there's a teeny bit of a backlash because people that are into ACT get a bit too passionate about it, and they keep throwing lots and lots of research, and then people think as if, ACT is the answer to everything. So just because of this research is finding that it is helpful in all these thousands of studies doesn't mean that it's for you, specifically the ACT model. Everyone's different. So try the different exercises and see if they work for you. We may have time for a couple today. However, I believe, and I could be wrong for sure, but I believe that a lot of therapeutic transformation coaching programs, the ones that have been found to actually work in randomized controlled trials and others, I think I'll be pretty sure I'll be willing to make a small bet on it, that there are the ACT flexibility processes underlying them. And it's those flexibility processes that's helping with the change. Okay, so a couple of people have talked about, how would it work in the workplace? I'll just touch on it a little bit now in that, if you're using it in a workplace setting, it's about helping people to be clear about their values, helping them to make their work meaningful for them rather than forcing them to have some other value forced upon them, and then teaching them that actually, the stress is a feeling, the anxiety is a feeling, the sadness is a feeling, the loneliness is a feeling, the frustration is a feeling. We don't need to get rid of them. Let's make space for them and keep moving in the direction we want to move in. And even the organization as a whole can start getting clear about what the values of the organization, how can the organization move in that direction and make space for the difficulties that come up in that process. So it's very much it's one way of putting it, which I really love as well, is that ACT is not about symptom reduction. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier, but we don't focus on symptom reduction. So the traditional approach is that, your problem is your levels of anxiety, and so we need to use these techniques to get to lower our anxiety. But it's not so much about solving that problem of the anxiety. The anxiety is actually giving you a clue to what you care about. So one of the favorite quotes in ACT is, we hurt where we care and we care where we hurt. So for example, if you have someone that is struggling with social anxiety, they're hurting because they care about relationships. If they didn't care about relationships, they probably wouldn't have any social anxiety, right? The anxiety wouldn't come up because it doesn't matter to them. So connecting it to what's happening right now, we're in the midst of this virus and there's lots of hurt and pain coming up for some people, and some people are actually enjoying the huge changes that we're having right now too. But the hurt and the pain that's coming up is because of things that we care about. We've lost certain freedoms that we had before, and so we're hurting. And that's perhaps a good thing, because if we're hurting about something that we care about, we care about being able to connect with people. We care about connecting with people and being physically close to them and hugging them and all that. And so, of course, it's going to hurt. That's a sign that that's important to us. And if it didn't hurt at all, that means we wouldn't care about it. If we didn't care about it, then it wouldn't be so important for us. So we hurt where we care, and we care where we hurt. And so one way to work out your values is to look at what hurts you. What if you reflect on your past, what were the moments that were very painful for you, very difficult for you, what they hurt you? What was it? What value do you think that you had was being challenged that caused that pain? And that will give you some clue about what you care about. I remember when I first became a school teacher, I was just doing it, I didn't think about the process of standing in front of a class of teenagers and teaching them, because I was just so passionate about my mindfulness and wanting to share it with the world. And found it really, really hard. I felt very, very anxious at the beginning, teaching, and every lesson after lesson after lesson. It took so much. I had to do it so many times before I was able to overcome that. And it's because if I cared about how well I did, and I wanted to make sure that the children learned well. And I suppose I felt judged if they didn't respond in a positive way at that time. So there was a little bit of that too. But there was definitely a care there, and therefore the hurt came up. And I remember there was some teachers that were training to become school teachers, and they didn't have any lesson plans, and they just came in and they just made stuff up, and they didn't really care, and they left the profession very quickly too. So there wasn't any hurt there, but there wasn't much care there either, I felt anyway. So we've got about 5 minutes or so. I'm just thinking what would be the best thing to show you. I'm not going to go through this detailed thing because it will take a little bit more than 5 minutes. I want to show you some other stuff. So just to explain to you what this was all about, because you do have the slides as well. So this is about, this is called sometimes in ACT, creative hopelessness. And it's not about reducing your hope, but the idea is to get you or your clients to reflect, what are all the different techniques I've done to try and get rid of, let's say it's anxiety. So let's say if you want to get rid of the anxiety and you want to get rid of the thoughts that I can't do it or whatever, what are all the different techniques you've done? And they do everything. They may say everything from, drinking to drugs, to alcohol, to yoga, maybe to certain therapies, to meditation. And some of them may have worked in the short term, some of them in the long term, and they may have impacted their quality of life in other ways. So for example, yoga made them feel better in the short term, maybe also in the long term. So it's having a good impact on their life, carry on. The drinking, in the short term, it worked. In the long term, actually, it didn't make them feel very good. And what else did it impact? Impacted their relationships too. So what ACT is saying is that if something's working for you, keep using it. But if it's not working for you, what about if we take a radically different approach? The thing about ACT is it's not yet another fixing model. And that's why this creative hopelessness approach is important. It's very important to take the time to really feel, I've tried all these different things to fix my problem. I've tried this therapy, this prayer. And now I'm coming to ACT as another therapy. But maybe this is not like any other therapy. Maybe this is actually about making peace with these passengers, which I've used so many different ways of trying to get rid of those passengers. Maybe I just need to take these passengers with me. And it feels like it's a bit of a failure. But actually, once you start driving in the destination of your dreams, those passengers may be sometimes noisy, sometimes less noisy, sometimes annoying, sometimes not annoying. But it doesn't matter because you're moving in the direction of what matters to you. So that's the idea of that. So this is just a simple exercise that we won't do now, but it's essentially an exercise you can do yourself, or again, if you happen to have clients and stuff, that sense of pushing away. So you could do an exercise where you take your hands out and you push as hard as you can, keep pushing. And this is using the metaphor of pushing away your difficult thoughts, your difficult emotions, trying to fix them. And when you do that, you get tired. Effort is being wasted, and your attention is not lining up with what the direction you want to go in. We're saying take those difficulties with you. If your hands represent your difficulties, rather than trying to push them away all the time, just take your hands with you, take your difficulties with you, and move in line with what your dreams, what's really, really important for you. There's so many metaphors. This is another one which I won't share right now. And so the last thing I want to finish with is to be clear with yourselves. What is it that we can change and what we can't? Can we change our thoughts? Can we change our feelings? Or can we change our behavior? And I think a lot of suffering that we have and others have is because of we think we can control things that we actually can't. And just the example I gave earlier at the beginning of this talk about positive thinking, it seems like, oh yeah, we must be able to change our thoughts to positive. But if we could just have positive thoughts just by choosing to have positive thoughts, there would be no depression in the world, would there? Everyone just choose positive thoughts and we'd be done. But it's the leading cause of disability in the whole planet. So it doesn't work like that, obviously. So, that classic exercise, don't think about something for 30 seconds and you'll find it impossible. Not only will you find it impossible, but you will actually be focusing so much on not thinking of elephants, you'll be missing out on life. So that's the first thing. But can you control? So what we're saying in this exercise is you can't control your thoughts so easily. And if you do this exercise, if you can't even control your thoughts for 30 seconds or 1 minute, what chance have you to control your thoughts over your lifetime? So we're not going to try and control our thoughts. That's the first thing. Secondly, can't control our emotions. Every time you're angry, if someone says relax, or every time you feel stressed, someone says relax, can you instantly relax? When you're stressed, someone says calm down, you're like, oh yeah, calm down, thank you. I'm just going to calm down now. Doesn't work like that, does it? Or if someone says cheer up or take a chill pill, rather than making us more calm, it makes us even more annoyed, doesn't it? So we can't control our emotions like that. But our actions we can control. So a simple example of that is I'm going to show you this one diffusion exercise, and then we'll go into the Q&A in a sec. And so an example of a diffusion exercise that we could all do. So right now, hold your arms out and say in your head, I cannot move my arms. I cannot move my arms. Really fuse with that thought. I cannot move my arms. Cannot move my arms. So really think about that. And I want you to disobey your thoughts on purpose. So I want you to start moving your arms around as you're saying in your head, I can't move my arms. I can't move my arms. I can't move my arms. I cannot move my arms. That simple technique is a diffusion technique, actually. And it helps you to see, sometimes for some people, for the very first time, that their thoughts and their behavior are not directly linked. And through that process of diffusion, people are able to step back from all sorts of their passengers on the bus, start reducing the control of what the direction their bus goes in a lot straight away. So that's just one example of a diffusion technique, but I'll share some more if they come up organically in the Q&A. But I'll just finish with the summary slide, which is that ACT offers a whole range of different exercise metaphors and mindful reflections for a different way of living. The goal is psychological flexibility, and arguably has more evidence for it than any other measure for things like well-being and resilience. And it's about learning to live a rich and meaningful life while we take our unhelpful thoughts, feelings, sensations along with us for the ride, rather than focusing our time and energy on fixing them, which isn't even possible anyway. Okay, so thank you very much for listening and for being here and for being part of this experimental approach of doing this online. I am now ready for your questions. And I think Niall's going to unmute people to be able to talk. Oh, he popped up.
Thank you very much for a great talk. That was brilliant. Thank you. I think everyone really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Now we're going to start inviting people into the room to ask questions. Okay, so I'm going to turn my webcam off and I'm going to invite some people in. I'm starting with a lady called Valerie Farmer. So Valerie, you're going to receive an invitation now to join the room. Okay, so just give me a second and I will invite you in. We'll give this a try.
Thanks for all the positive feedback. Glad you enjoyed the talk. Valerie doesn't seem to have appeared. While we're waiting for Valerie to pop up, I'll just leave this slide where you can get some more info.
Not allowing me to invite her in, so I'll ask the question on her behalf. Valerie asks, how does this work with psychosis? Can it be used when someone is in a psychotic episode?
I believe it is. I'm not a therapist, actually, so I haven't worked with psychosis, so I don't want to comment on that. But I believe it is used for psychosis, and I'm happy to kind of look it up and share research with you, but I don't know the answer to that, sorry.
Okay, no problem. The next question is from Sophia Maria Clues. So could you please tell us about how we could use ACT with alcohol abuse?
Yeah, so it is used for kind of substance abuse and addiction. Again, I'm sorry, I don't know about the specifics for specific therapies, so I don't know exactly how it's used from substance abuse, but the principles are always the same. Remember, you're all sharing kind of different challenges and how it'd be used for them, and I'm sure there's certain programs and techniques that are used from them, but they would be drawing on these 6 principles. So, for example, and here I'll be guessing if I was creating such a program, but it would be if someone's using the drinking, you'd explore, okay, you've been drinking, what have you tried so far? So you'd use the creative hopelessness approach. So you've tried this, this, and this to reduce your addiction. Okay, what if you were not drinking, if alcohol addiction wasn't a problem for you, how would you be spending your time? What would you be doing? So you'd start becoming clear on what their values are, what would make their life meaningful. Once you became clear about what made their life meaningful, you say, okay, if let's put the alcohol stuff aside. What you would be doing is you'd be, being this race driver. Let's say that as an example. Okay, you love driving and you'd be a Formula One driver. Okay, what is it about Formula One driving that you love? Oh, I love interacting with people and challenging myself. So challenging yourself is one of your values, like moving towards them. That makes it meaningful for you. Okay, so if that's meaningful for you, does drinking the alcohol help? No. What are the kind of thoughts and feelings that you're having that's causing it? And then you teach them mindful skills. So you'd probably have a session where you teach them about breathing, being present, about noticing the sensations that are coming up and giving them the ability to accept those feelings and not immediately going to alcohol to deal with that. But the beauty of it is that because they're more clear about what creates that gives meaning to their lives, they've got that motivation, and that motivation becomes the drive for reducing the drinking so that they can do what they really want to do, because of actually they don't want to just be drunk all the time, they want to do something else. So I also know that ACT has been working with the 12-step program, and they've worked out some ways in which they can tag the ACT principles together with the 12-step approach to have something which is more evidence-based as well. So they're the bits and pieces that I know about the approach.
Thanks very much, Shamash. Okay, so the next question is from Mr. David Beals. And David has asked, can you expand on diffusion when threat responses interfere with the ability to take meaningful action?
Yeah, so with these 6 principles, let me just go back to, so actually I can share them with you. So you wouldn't automatically use one principle for one approach. So let's say if you or your client is experiencing a strong threat response, maybe the thing to do there may be some mindfulness. It might be about feeling the sensations of their feet on the floor, wriggling their feet, doing some mindful movement perhaps, maybe doing the grounding exercise that I shared. So that might be the first step you take. Then you may think, actually, okay, we want to use the diffusion technique. What diffusion technique? So for the diffusion, you would think about what sentences or thoughts. So I've shared with you one diffusion technique, but let me share some other ones. So one thing that's been researched is literally the sentence, I notice I'm having the thought. They've actually done a bunch of research on that. So if your thought is that I can never give a speech in public, okay? So that could be the thought that's triggering the stress response. So you just ask them to, first of all, think the negative thought. Don't run away from it. Like, I cannot give a speech in public and everyone's going to, laugh at me or something. So you just allow yourself to think that. then you tell yourself or the client, I notice I'm having the thought, I cannot give a speech in public. And then you will notice that as soon as you do that, and please try this later on yourselves, you'll notice straight away there's a little bit of distance between you and the thought. And so there's a bit of diffusion happening. But there's literally hundreds of these techniques that you can find online and in books. But one of my favorite and funny ones is to actually sing it to a tune. And you can actually sing it to a tune of Happy Birthday. So for example, I have had in the past, and sometimes still do, this thought, I'm not good enough. So I tried this just 3 or 4 times. It made me laugh a lot. And now it's not so much of an issue. It doesn't trigger the emotion. So I literally used to sing, I am not good enough. You can join with me if you want. I am not good enough. And just sung it a few times. You can see how Nal's laughing already. I found it funny myself. Other people have tried it too. And rather than trying to run away from the thought, you're taking the thought and you're reframing it. You're putting it into the context of a song, and then the sound and the picture and the meaning start to disconnect, and so there's a diffusion process happening. So these are the 3 most popular and most powerful approaches for diffusion.
Brilliant, Shamash. Thank you. The next question is from Renee Martina, and she's asked, so you've mentioned DBT. Can you speak more about how ACT and DBT work together?
Yeah, so the third wave therapies are MBCT, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, ACT, which we've talked about today, and DBT, dialectic behavior therapy. Now, as I haven't studied DBT, so I don't know it in detail, but I believe it's a specific program, just like MBCT is a program, whereas ACT is these 6 processes that can be applied in any way. So when you're doing DBT, there will be mindfulness skills that you do in there, and that will be tuning into the ACT approach of using, being present. There will be skills of becoming clear about what your values are. So that will be the ACT skills from the value section. There'll be about taking action. And so there'll be some of the ACT skills there. So ACT processes are underlying many different kind of coaching approaches, therapeutic approaches, or everyday approaches that we take in our lives. So that's all I know in terms of the connection between the 2.
Cool. Okay. The next one's from Celine Pasty. Now, isn't it just a matter of better diagnosis? There's less stigma about mental health now than 20 years ago. So this is in regard to being worse or.
That's really interesting. And Dr. Stephen Hayes challenges that. So there's the DMV book where they kind of try to work out classifications of different so-called mental health perhaps diseases, and he would put in the quotation marks because he challenges that. Apparently there's so many different disorders that are being found out in the mental health world that are growing at such a rate that in 20 years time there would be more different types of diseases than there are people in the United States. He said something along those lines. So even the people that were doing the research for that book to classify people for their different mental health diseases are saying it's not working. Actually, this approach of classifying them as diseases is not right. And so what ACT has done is, rather than trying to work out this is for this disease and this is for that disease, it's saying what are the underlying processes which cause all the different challenges and diseases, and how can we help that? So that's why I described it as this transdiagnostic approach, where you can apply these 6 processes for all sorts of different challenges. So it's not about us having to necessarily diagnose all the different challenges. DSM, yes, thank you, Liz.
Cool. Okay. The next one is from Tiffany Carthy. You mentioned a study that found mindfulness was more effective than PMR and relaxation techniques for depression. Do you know if this was the case for anxiety as well?
I don't know if the study's been done on anxiety, but Stephen Hayes' specific experience challenged that. For example, he discovered ACT because he started to have a panic disorder. And I think we've got a bit of time, so I'll quickly share the story. And this will kind of link to the answer to your question. So he was a psychologist, he was a lecturer at university, and there were 2 lecturers in front of him that were fighting. And he started to feel anxious and his heart started to beat really fast. He put his hand up to tell them to stop fighting. but his heart was racing so fast, he was feeling so anxious, words didn't come out of his mouth. And so they're like, what's wrong with you? And they just carried on fighting. But he felt really bad about this. And so he went on a quest to try and fix the problem. And so one of the techniques he used was relaxation. But his core problem was he was trying to get rid of the problem, as I've been talking about today. So he started to use relaxation techniques. So he'd be sitting at his desk, writing his paper, and he'd think, oh, I'm feeling so relaxed. Calm and relaxed, calm and relaxed. So he started saying that to him. And then suddenly his heart would start beating faster. He'd be like, calm and relaxed, calm and relaxed. And his heart would beat faster. And before you know it, he would have another panic attack. So he tried all these other techniques, and everything he tried, the, cognitive, challenging his negative thoughts, the relaxation, avoiding giving talks, none of that worked. And he ended up having such a severe panic attack. He basically thought he had to go to hospital. He was on the floor in his bedroom. 3 years of this happened. And then I would say what he had was a spiritual experience, in the sense of he tuned into his transcendent self. He suddenly discovered, after 3 years, I've been using all these techniques to get rid of my difficult emotions. So in that case, it was the anxiety. I've been running away from my anxiety using relaxation, cognitive reappraisal, avoidance strategies. All of that was not working, no matter how hard he tried. The harder he tried, the worse he got. And eventually he took the approach of acceptance, approach of, I'm going to take this together with me. And I am not my emotions. I'm not my thoughts. I'm the observer of them. And they can do whatever they want, but I'm going to carry on living my life together with them. And that moment on was the transformation of his life. So although this is all these 6 skills, seems like all these different pivots and ways that you need to change, the transformation can happen just like that. He calls them pivots. Like suddenly you go from avoidance to acceptance. Suddenly you go from living a life of just happiness in the future, achieving goals in the future, to making space and taking action and living a meaningful life with your values in the here and now. So, yeah, that's my answer.
Great answer. The next one's from Alexandra Anna Maria, and she's asking about the arrows. What about trauma as the first arrow? And is the second arrow really a choice anymore?
Oh, the 2 arrows. For example, like trauma, you could give as an example, but any kind of thought that pops into our head or emotion that pops into our head, we don't have the choice about that either, do we? So I see what you mean in that, something's happened in our lives, a difficult thought has come, a difficult emotions are coming, or difficult memories are coming back up for us. So that we don't have a choice about. What ACT is saying is that once that has happened, where do we have the choice? Where can we start to make space and allow things to be as they are, and start thinking about the direction I want my life to go in? So I see what you mean in terms of the trauma and the experience that may come from that, and the fact that we want to avoid it. And that's totally understandable. And we're saying that, yes, there's still within that some choice. There's a part of you that's observing it. So even with the traumatic experience, as long as you're not overwhelmed by it, I guess, there's a part of you that can observe it and witness it and be able to make a different choice. But those choices, we're not saying this is going to be immediate and it's going to transform your life straight away, obviously, but it can be applied in that way. And I do know that I haven't studied them, but there are specific ACT programs for trauma. So there have been studies on that.
Okay, cool. We've got time for maybe 1 or 2 more. This one's from Kate Montfort. So could ACT or could ACT be applied as part of an integrated counseling approach? And do you feel ACT fits more with CBT than a humanistic, person-centered approach? Or can it be applied across the board?
Thank you for your question. It can definitely be applied across the board. CBT is kind of changing a lot, and it's going in a direction which is more kind of aligned with ACT, I would say, because of the more modern approaches of CBT use mindfulness and acceptance-based approaches. So yes, but it can be honestly used with almost any other approach that you wish. Like I said, it's not even just isolated to therapies, so it could be very much used in coaching. We haven't had a chance to talk too much about that, but a lot of coaching programs are all about setting goals, aren't they? And they're quite often nowadays also about clarifying values. And some of them also involve mindfulness skills too. And then there are some ACT programs, which are like acceptance and commitment coaching, for example. There's a book with that title, which is taking acceptance and commitment training and combining it with a coaching approach for transformation. So as I said, it can be used across the board, therapies and coaching approaches, and can also be used beyond just the individual to groups, teams, communities, nations, and beyond.
Brilliant, Shamash. So last question from Ruth Hughes. Are there any studies on whether this applies cross-culturally, please? For example, in collectively oriented rather than more individualistic cultures?
The studies on ACT have been done all over the world, and different cultures sometimes create slightly different programs, so they kind of draw them differently, and that's absolutely fine. You can be flexible in that approach. And yes, they have found it to be applicable across different cultures, so they've definitely tested that. And the ACT community is called ACBS, Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, ACBS. I've just typed that in. It's a very thriving, multicultural, multinational community that meets in person once a year, and they have an active online forum where they share. The membership is, starts from just £5 or £10 a year, so you can become a member and you can access a lot of resources there. And yeah, it takes a very creative and flexible and fun approach to ACT, and they're very excited together to move the movement forward.